So a very good morning to you all and welcome to Church House and to the Forces in Mind Trust Research Centre Conference. We are very pleased to see you here. I'm Mike Almond, I'm the FiMT Research Centre Professor at Anglo-Ruskin University. This is the fourth conference event organised by the FiMT Research Centre and Anglo-Ruskin University, but only the second face-to-face, and how things have changed since the first one we held in 2018. The two frequently asked questions about the conference is why do we have one and what are we trying to achieve? The first question is easy to answer given the numbers in the room and the fact that we did have an oversubscription for tickets. Clearly there's a need or a demand for a UK single conference or even a European event covering the wide concerns and topics relevant to veterans and their families. What then should a conference contain? The FiMT Research Centre is very fortunate to have an advisory board to whom we are most grateful for having steered us through the past 5 years. The group's drawn from all 4 UK devolved nations. It has 1 international member and has expertise in all areas likely to concern veterans and families. With their advice and with our experience in populating the hub with evidence-based research and outcomes, we have chosen to highlight today the best practice from each nation. The RC is a research force multiplier or a research support organisation. It's not intended to generate primary research itself, but to promote quality work, highlight this to policymakers, to practitioners, including charities, the media and to veterans themselves to demonstrate the benefits that research has delivered. That then has driven the content of today's meeting: research, practice, and impact. However, you are the most important people in the room today. Your presence, your questions, networking, visiting the posters, and at the end of the conference enjoying the hospitality of this wonderful building, and I'm promised a fantastic sunset onto the cathedral on the balcony with canopies and wine later. There are some important points I have to address. The first, if you haven't already spotted it, the code for the Wi-Fi is Westminster and then the number 1, and Westminster is with a capital W. If you haven't already done so, please pick up your badges and register at the desks just so we can keep track of people here today. You all have a copy of the programme and speaker biographies in your pack. Equally, you have slips to put your questions down on paper using the FiMT pen. Please hold those slips up as the question forms in your head after you've written them, and one of our team will collect them from you and deliver them to the chair here, who will ask them on your behalf at the end of the session, just in case people are too bashful to do so from the floor. Please do that during the session, and don't wait till the end, otherwise there'll be a big flurry of confetti as people try and track the papers down. Keep your phones on silent, of course, but do feel free to use Twitter to promote the event. There's no need to necessarily photograph slides or speakers. The sessions are being filmed and they will be on the hub next week. At the same time next week, we'll also be asking for feedback. There are no fire alarm practices today. If the fire alarm goes, please exit using the doors in the corners and follow the staff. Finally, for those of you who are regular hub users and have a keen eye, you will have noticed over the last 24 hours the hub looks different. It's had a refresh, it's more appealing to those with visual impairment, and it's quicker and simpler to navigate with you identified as a researcher, a veteran, or a policymaker. Many thanks indeed goes to Chris Flutie on our staff for organising that to coincide with the conference. And now, finally, to introduce the conference itself, I invite Mike Ellicock to the stand. Mike was appointed the FiMT Chief Executive almost a year ago now, having spent time in the city, business and charity sectors. And importantly to us, he's a veteran himself and served in places like Sierra Leone and Iraq. There's one change I need to mention on the programme before Mike introduces the conference properly, and that 10 minutes has been stolen from your lunch, from the programme that's in your pack, and there's an additional speaker at 13:40, so we need to be back in the room after lunch at 13:40. Over to you, Mike.
Great. Thank you very much, Mike and Alex and the whole team from Anglia-Ruskin University who've putting this conference on today. So I can't take any credit for today, but it's fantastic to be here. It's fantastic to see you all. It is a bit surreal having all of you looking back at me in person, but I'll cope with it. So a tiny bit from me at the start here, then I'm going to hand over to Jesse and Sam from the Office of Veterans Affairs, and then there's a little bit from me at the end where I have the privilege of presenting 2 awards, so please do stay to the final bit. I'll try and do that quickly, and then you can go and get the drinks and the sunset that Mike described. So yeah, this is my first conference as Chief Exec of Forces in Mind Trust. I took over from Ray Locke in June, so not quite a year. I'm absolutely trying to get my head up to speed around everything that goes on in this area. So I hadn't ever, when I was first approached about the role, I hadn't heard of Forces in Mind Trust. I hadn't heard of the concept of a spend-out trust, but the way it was pitched to me is that this is a lottery thing, set up 2012 with £35 million. We've done a decade of work, and there's a decade to go. There's £20 million and a decade to try and have as much impact on veterans and their families as possible. And I thought, well, what's not to like about that? Just what a fantastic opportunity, particularly as I'd spent most of the last decade desperately trying to fundraise and also have impact on a much bigger group of society with not too much success. So coming into this space, it's been absolutely wonderful to see the collaborative nature of the space, the myriad charities that we've got supporting the subgroup of the population that we're interested in. The fact that government now has really, picked up the baton as well with the creation of the Office of Veterans Affairs in 2019. We've got the covenant. It feels to me like there's been so much progress in the last decade. There's still, of course, a huge amount to do, but it's been a privilege to come into a space where there's so many people. A lot of the success over the last decade is very much down to all of you to come in and then to try and think about where we, as Forces in Mind Trust, can have the most impact. And I have to say, coming into the space, it's been quite hard for me to get my head around that. We as Forces in Mind Trust have 7 program areas. As set out in strategy for our veterans in 2018, which Mary Mayhew was seconded from Forces in Mind Trust to support the writing of. We've got 4 change mechanisms as well. But as I started to get into it, I started to realise that I think the way in which we have worked successfully over the past decade and the way in which I'd like to continue as a charity is thinking really about 3 areas. So the first one is about what are the barriers to successful transition? Can we identify those in each of the different domains of life for veterans and their families? The second one is around, well, what works to address those barriers? So that's very much the research centre that Anglia-Ruskin have led since 2017 is very much part of that whole what works space. And then the third bit is, well, what can we do collectively to bring about change? That might be policy change, but it might be about implementation on the ground, and policy might be there in place to really bring about that change and have an impact on veterans and their families and support their successful and sustainable transition. So I asked the FiMT team to kind of retrofit the work that we funded to date into those 3 categories. And when you do that, you can see that of the £23 million that Forces in Mind Trust has put into this space to date, 11.7 million is broadly on identifying barriers to successful transition. About 9 million has been spent on the what works space, and including the research centre. And then about 3.5 million has been spent on making change happen on the ground. So things like the second No Homeless Veterans campaign, which is going on at the moment within the housing space. So I think conceptually for me coming in, there's something about, there are still spaces in which we need to know more about what the barriers are to successful transition. There's still a lot of work we can do around identifying what works and testing different approaches to enable veterans to transition successfully. And I think there's a huge amount that we collectively can do around really making that change happen on the ground in Hull or in Sheffield or in Doncaster or in Cardiff and in Northern Ireland and in Scotland as well. So that's what I'm really interested in, working with all of you to think about all the work that we do in those kind of three bundles and seeing how much impact that we can have as a small charity, but very much working with all of these different organisations, with COBCO, with statutory provision now, with DWP doing a lot of stuff, with the NHS and all the work that Kate Davis and her team are doing. There's so much good work going on in this space, and I'm hoping that we can be a lubricant or something like that to try and facilitate that and to try and keep and build on the progress that I feel that has really been made in this first decade, or the first decade of FiMT in the last 10 years. So really looking forward to working with all of you. I'm very happy to be here. Please do come and say hi and all of that kind of thing during the course of the day. I think that's probably it from me, and I'm going to hand over to Jessie, the Director of the Office for Veterans Affairs.
Thanks, Mike. Can I just check you can hear me? Yeah, that is working, isn't it? My name's Jessie Owen. I'm the Director of the Office for Veterans Affairs. I'm almost 1 year in post, so it's been an amazing sort of privilege to come in and lead the sort of government's effort on veterans. I'm not a veteran myself, but I have spent almost 15 years in the civil service. So I want to talk today about sort of what the OVA is for and sort of who we are and what we do, highlight our Minister's key priorities that we've been focusing on, and then touch a little bit on sort of the future areas of interest, and particularly sort of where this great sort of broad community that we've got here today can sort of help us understand where we best focus our policy sort of effort in the years ahead. So starting out with the OVA, we're a small kind of policy strategy unit in the heart of government, in the Cabinet Office, so not MOD as some people expect, but that enables us to really draw on the close relationships we have with the Treasury and Number 10 and do the knitting across the various government departments that have a role in supporting a veteran as they transition to civilian life. So our role is to kind of coordinate that effort, encourage the different policy departments to think about veterans as they develop their policies, and to really help kind of develop and share insight. And that's where sort of all the work that all of you do can help plug into us, and we can help government really understand where it can best intervene. Hopefully, many of you will have seen that in January this year we published the Veteran Strategy Action Plan, setting out what government intends to do over the next 2 years to kind of turn the dial on achieving the strategy for our veterans, which was published in 2018 and set out a 10-year vision of how we make this the best place to be a veteran. There are 3 broad themes set out in the action plan, and they basically cover what the OVA is here to do. One is around understanding our veterans, and that's the kind of research and data programme, which is obviously so important and kind of underpins all of our other work. Transforming policies and services so that they're really optimised for veterans and their families, and championing our veterans so that people have a much better understanding of their experience and the value that they can bring sort of as they progress out of military service. We're in the process at the moment of setting up all the systems that we need to sort of monitor and track that. There are a lot of commitments in there, and part of our role now is to be holding the other bits of government to account to make sure that they deliver on time, but really importantly have the impact and the benefits that we expect. We have sort of 5 kind of priority areas that ministers are particularly interested in that I thought it was worth just emphasising here today. The first one is veterans' employment, not just making sure that veterans have jobs, but they have a really rich and rewarding career when they leave our armed forces. And that kind of the whole of society gets to make the most and maximise the use of the skill set and experience that people get from being in the armed forces. We're particularly focused over the next couple of years of bringing that to bear in our public services. So rolling out the Great Place to Work scheme, for example, that makes it easier for veterans to join the civil service, working with colleagues in health and their fantastic Step Into Health programme that helps veterans progress into the NHS. Looking at setting up similar schemes in the police, MOJ have announced something for helping veterans move into the prison service. We absolutely want to make sure that we can enrich our public services with the great talent that is available as people leave their military service. Veteran health and well-being is another priority, and improving and further sort of extending the pathways that give veterans the access to the right sort of mental and physical health. The government is already investing sort of over 20 million additional money on this in the next 3 years, helping to extend and improve and deepen op courage and integrate the services that sit under that, but also looking at the Veterans Trauma Network and making sure that the physical sort of clinical pathways match the great strides that have been made on mental health. On top of that, in the autumn last year, the Chancellor announced a £5 million Health Innovation Fund, which the OVA will be distributing over the coming year, which is really looking to kind of drive sort of new ideas, new pathways, new treatments, and kind of innovation in veterans' healthcare, so that we have kind of even more effective treatment, particularly for kind of hard to treat areas in the future. The third priority is really managing sort of the impact of legacy sort of operations on those that were involved in them. Government has already passed the Overseas Operations Act. It's committed to doing something to address the legacy of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. And we're working hard with government partners in the MOD and the Northern Ireland office, particularly to make sure that veterans and their families get the support they need as changes are introduced in Northern Ireland, and enable veterans to tell their stories and be heard, so that that experience, and particularly of the kind of Op Banner veterans, isn't lost. Really relevant to what we're here to talk about today, we want to make sure that we're driving a sort of whole UK approach. Our armed forces is UK-wide, the Covenant is UK-wide, veterans and their families go on to live in sort of every bit of the UK. We want to really put more effort into how we ensure consistency of support and experience, even as devolved administrations take quite different approaches and obviously have the freedom to take different approaches. We're really keen on sort of cross UK join-up and collaboration. And working, we've got good relationships with colleagues in our devolved administrations in Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales. There is now a Veterans Commissioner for every corner of the UK. The Welsh Veterans Commissioner was announced a few weeks ago and will be starting shortly. And this conference is a great sort of epitome, really, of the effort that's needed to bring together sort of across the four nations and factor devolution into our thinking so that we can build those kind of cross-nation approaches. And the final sort of area of priority is around making sure that kind of every veteran counts and recognising the diversity of the veteran cohort. And we want to do more to sort of acknowledge and celebrate that, but also address some of the issues that come with being sort of an underrepresented group in the armed forces. So recent research and the report that came out of the Defence Committee on the experience of women veterans, for example, has shown that obviously whilst many completely benefit from their time in the military, it's not always a positive experience. And we need to look at what more we can do, for example, to address the poorer employment outcomes that women veterans experience. How do we confront the kind of culture of sort of misogyny and intolerance of abuse that can sometimes lead to very sort of negative outcomes for women veterans? And that's just an example. It's not just women. We're also looking, for example, at the experience of LGBT veterans who served when there was still a ban in place on their service. We've announced that we'll be doing a review into that, and that will be launching shortly, so that can sort of shine a light on the sort of lasting impact that experience has had. Underpinning all of those priorities is better data and research, and us working in partnership with everyone in this room today, because there remains an awful lot about our veterans that we don't know, including sort of simple facts like how many there are and where they are. And I've mentioned 1,000 times how excited I am about the census, and it always just seems just around the corner when we're going to get our hands on that data, but it will come, and then it will give us sort of unparalleled insight. But there's also loads of different research, sort of scope for further research, and Mike has highlighted some of those, and I'll let Sam say a little bit more about our research and data programme and what we're doing now in the OVA. Before I get to that, I just want to look briefly to the future and casting our eyes out beyond sort of the immediate work programme into some kind of likely areas of interest that we know in the OVA that we'll be interested in, and that over the coming years we'll want to turn our attention to. So we know that the veteran population will be shrinking, and that presents the challenge of how to maintain the connectedness between a smaller veteran population and the wider, the rest of society, who will have less sort of near experience of what it's like serving in the military, and how does that impact on perceptions and the way that people are received when they might move from military to civilian life. We know that the veteran population is ageing. Do we know enough about how needs change as that population sort of ages, and how our services need to adapt to respond to that change? And in particular, how experience in service kind of either persists or changes sort of over time. The veteran population, as a result of the effort made by our kind of armed forces, sort of today and in the more recent past, is becoming more diverse. There will be sort of more women, for example, serving and in different sorts of roles. What difference will that make to their sort of support needs and their experience? We know that the nature of service itself is changing as the military sort of obviously moves with the times and with changes of technology. That involves kind of both kind of the type of combat with more sort of remote warfare and cyber warfare and so on, but also kind of ways of life as things like the accommodation strategy takes hold and more people are living in sort of private sector accommodation and more integrated into the local communities. We'll have a lot more people becoming veterans who are sort of from the digital native generation. You know, how will all those experiences affect their experience sort of in service and then their transition into civilian life? So we definitely have sort of gaps in our knowledge to fill that will emerge over time, but there's also things, you know, that we're really interested to learn more about today. For example, the lasting impact of service on families and children and relationships and how that changes as people move out of the military. And in the immediate term, sort of the forefront of sort of all of our minds, the huge impact that the cost of living is going to have on all of us as we kind of see this really high sort of inflation and increases in energy costs and food prices and so on. Obviously that's affecting everybody and veterans as part of society will be affected. But what impact in particular is that having could that have on the veteran community? Are there any special sort of requirements or needs that come from past service that we need to consider and factor into what we focus on in the year ahead? And finally, before I kind of hand over to Sam, I can't really speak to you today without talking about what's happening in the Ukraine. 1 month in from sort of Putin's illegal invasion, and I know that kind of the images of the terrible sort of war that's happening there are kind of very moving and affecting everybody that's been following the news, and the heroic sort of Ukrainian resistance as well is absolutely sort of affecting and inspirational. We know that veterans want to help. Our challenge is to try and channel that and enable that in a way that makes the most impact and that avoids sort of risk of future escalation. We know that some veterans will be triggered by what they see and that will remind them of their sort of experiences and potential trauma, just like we experienced last year with all the scenes of the withdrawal from Afghanistan. So we need to make sure that we're responding to that sort of with sensitivity and speed, most importantly. When the war is over, which it surely will be at some point, there will be a lot that we can learn from their experience. We've got a whole nation suddenly populated with unexpected veterans. And really importantly, there will be a lot that we can offer in terms of support for their recovery based on our learning and our experiences and our research. But fundamentally, sort of for me, watching sort of a brutal dictator invade a democratic and sovereign sort of neighbour really reminded me of the critical role that our military plays in protecting this country, and not just this country, but sort of Europe and all of our allies. And the service and sacrifice of the men and women that serve in our armed forces is the bedrock of the security and freedom of all of us. And I'm really grateful for that. And all of Europe at the moment is appreciating the military strength of the UK and the role it plays in sort of European and kind of Euro-Atlantic security. So the work we do and the support for our veterans and their families is our expression of that gratitude, and it's our duty, I think, to get that right, and that really emphasises why everything that we all do and what we're here to talk about today is so important. But Sam is now going to talk in more detail about how the research and data aspect is important to our work.
Thanks, Jessie. Again, can I just check that you can hear me? You can. Great. Well, thanks very much for having us today, and thanks, Jessie, for introducing. For those of you who've heard me speak already at other events or on Zoom, you'll know that that I am new to role. I arrived in January into the LVA as the Deputy Director for Strategy, Research and Data, so this is very much my sphere. But I'm not new to this sector. I've spent 20 years as a reservist and a regular officer in the Army before leaving 4 years ago and spending a bit of time in the private sector. But having spent 2 decades surrounded by the military families, veterans and the community, it was still absolutely eye-opening to arrive here and see the sheer number of organisations, people, institutions, researchers, all of whom trying to do the very best that they can for the veteran community. It's eye-opening, but it's also deeply reassuring, and it's something that I think that we can all share in a kind of sense of good purpose towards the veteran community. It is a complicated space, and a complicated and congested one, and so the OVA is a relative newcomer to this area. I think needs to tread really carefully, particularly when it comes to research and data. And so you'll be pleased to hear that the OVA and my team will be seeking to publish a strategy and research paper later this year, setting out our role and the context of the OVA's research arm in the research space. Those of you who are eagle-eyed and familiar with the strategy action plan that Jesse talked about earlier will see that it's in there, page 39, paragraph 2. And it's in there because it's really important to set that context in the maturing space of the OVA's role in the research space. It's unlikely to contain lots of commitments that we're going to tick off and check. They're covered off in the strategy action plan and the strategy for our veterans. It's much more likely to be a document that sets a vision, a position for that arm, and hopefully sets it in context. Now, we haven't started writing it, there's no pen to paper, and we haven't yet started the formal consultation with externals on what might be in it. But I can tell you some of the headlines that I think will find their way into it really easily. So firstly, I think I can set out quite clearly what it will not say about the OVA. And that is that it will not say that the OVA should be an organisation that muscles in, pushes out other organisations that are either better placed, better resourced, or better funded. And that is not our role to push others out of this space. It's also, probably reassuring for many of you in the room, not going to be an organisation that provides some kind of top-down, government-authorised, heavy-handed coordination function, telling academics, free-thinking minds across really powerful research institutes across the UK what to research and, indeed, what not to research. And having had the pleasure of meeting loads of you already, I don't think that many of you would have listened to that anyway. We will always have a role to chair, to cajole, to convene, and to nudge, and to usher. And all of that will be in the interest of shining a light on gaps in policy. But I hope that that nudging and ushering will be one where we are listening more than telling. And I think that that's probably one of the more important things that I would hope you take away. So if that's what it's not, then what is it going to be, this research arm of the OVA? Well, I think if we were to boil it down and put it super simply, I hope that we're going to be the champions of high-quality research that informs policy or evaluates policy. That, in marketing sense or business speak, is our USP, because we're in the centre of government. The natural gravity of government and ministerial interest is always going to allow us a special opportunity to convene organisations of all different shapes and sizes, to draw attention to shine lights on where there are potentially gaps in research and knowledge, or potentially to evaluate policy that perhaps hasn't worked quite so well. And I think that we'll also have a specific role, and some of you will have heard me use this phrase before, in increasing the visibility and awareness of research that is already happening across the space. And if the academic community wants to continue to research things that are already being researched by something else, then great. There's a role for that kind of research. If it wants to change tack, then that's great too. But it's definitely not our role to be telling you to stop or to start. I think that applies equally to data as it does to research, actually. And Jesse mentioned earlier the unique position that we are in to be able to analyse government data. But for those of you who work in the data space, realise it's an incredibly complicated area governed by GDPR about consent and legislation. It's incredibly tricky for us to be able to build other data sets into analysis, but we will try that. But I can say again that I think that our data analysis work will be one that is iterative. It will build on a baseline, and we will hopefully bring data in from other sources where possible. And the intention of that is, of course, to build a really firm and rich data set for us to be able to make policy decisions and inform government choice. So how might we do all of that? Well, I think there are two themes of the same kind of coin, and they're both about collaboration, actually. So firstly, there's one about expert and technical collaboration, and there's a second point, which is probably more aligned with the theme of this conference, which is about decentralised engagement. And so I'll cover the expert and technical one first. So clearly, in order to launch a data and research strategy and to implement it, we're going to need a significant amount of expert and technical input into those discussions and to its implementation. And so I'm really delighted to be able to use this forum to tell you, the research community, and others, that the Office for Veterans Affairs is in the final stages of appointing its first academic advisory board. And it's really great to be able to see some of those faces in the room today. There's some of those members who are going to be on that board. The board will meet, I hope, for the first time very soon, where we will use that board in its capacity to help us shape these initial phases of the research strategy and how we might land it best. Members have been selected quite carefully. They are from different backgrounds, different matters of interest, different subject matters of interest, different specialisms, different universities from all over the UK. And that's absolutely deliberate, to bring a different set of mindsets and different opinions into the space and help us to inform that academic advisory board, and thereby helping us to inform better policy. But I hope that academic advisory board is mutually beneficial, that whilst we will undoubtedly take great advantage of the rich networks, links into universities across the UK, across all kinds of specialisms, I hope that that forum also allows the academic community to reach into the OVA to help them shape policy making, to help them shape research and findings, if it is indeed their intent to shape policy at the end of it. And the final point I wanted to talk about in terms of engagement was about that decentralised one, again, specifically about geography. So most of you will know that the OVA was one of the first of the Cabinet Office departments or business units to move part of its team out of London and into York. And I'm absolutely delighted to be building my team out of that York office. We've recruited people who are in the room. Ellie's here from Bradford. Another member of the team is travelling into the York office from Hull. And we've got somebody who was recruited from Plymouth who'll be moving up to York later this year. You know, it really is not a gimmick. It is my office. I will be working from there. And it has been really brilliant over the last couple of weeks to have welcomed members of this community into that York office for our initial introductions, chats, and to discuss their research. So it is real, and the office is out there. But I want to go slightly further than just saying that we've got an office in York too. Some of you will have been to our research summit held earlier this year. I would like to do more events like that. I would like to hold an annual research summit. But I would like those to wander around the UK, to find themselves in different universities at different corners of the north of England, of Scotland, Wales. And if any of you out there would like to partner with us, hint, hint, please do let me know in the coffee, and we'll see whether we can make that a reality. Because I think that by moving around, we'll bring different people together in a different forum, in a different place, and hopefully bring different ideas too. And so that cognitive diversity, bringing different thoughts and mindsets into this space, can only be a positive. Of course, outside of the UK, there's more to learn too. And we'll continue to engage with our Five Eyes colleagues and other partners. And I hope very much to attend the SIMVA conference in Halifax, Nova Scotia, if Jessie will sign off my business case this week. And a final word just on my approach in general about this research arm of the OVA. And it's about one of openness, discussion, and transparency. I will always be open and transparent as far as I can within the embargoes of government communications. But I'm really straightforward with my interactions with people. If you want to come and speak to me about an area that you think is concerning or that we have missed, then please just drop me an email, pick up the phone. The hybrid way of working has made a virtual coffee incredibly easy to organise. But if you want to come and speak to me in person, then I will be absolutely delighted to welcome you to York, where we can meet in person. So that's it. Look forward to the research strategy coming out later this year. It's really great to be here, and huge thanks to the team for organising what looks like it's going to be a really, really amazing day in terms of presentations. Thanks very much.